Hi and welcome to today's video, which is where we're going to be looking at property strategies and HMOs, so houses of multiple occupation. Now there are many different ways to make money from property. Rental income is certainly one of them, but luckily there's many different ways to actually make money from the rental income too. Now most buy-to-lets or traditional buy-to-lets are rented out to sort of couples or an individual or a family as one household. However, there is another option, which is depending on where the property is located, there can often be a market for renting out individual bedrooms or rooms within the property instead of the whole property. And this is often classed as a multi-let or a HMO, and you can find a full definition here on this government link. It's probably the simplest or the best way to kind of send you to describe, I suppose, what or what's classed as a house of multiple occupation. Now typically with HMOs you would rent out a fully furnished bedroom and people would share the communal areas of the property like the lounge or dining room or kitchens and bathrooms, and we'll go into a full I suppose breakdown later on in terms of how that works from a financial perspective and a strategy perspective. But typically, just to give you a bit of kind of background, it's a booming market at the moment with the demand for rooms growing really fast because many younger tenants have been priced out of the market now to actually buy their own properties due to larger deposits that are required for financing, but also they can't necessarily afford to rent their own place due to the rising living costs. So even owning your own place is obviously expensive, but simply renting your own place when you've got to pay for all the bills and stuff as well can be expensive too when you're just kind of starting out. So the demand is certainly increasing for that. Now, by taking advantage of the kind of I suppose the trend in the rental market as it stands at the moment, and the demand, and by providing a service and renting out bedrooms to individual tenants instead of the whole property to one household, and this is where you can significantly increase the income and the rental yields that you'll get from a property. Now, it's a specialist strategy and one that's going to get more popular really as the current kind of climate dictates. And it's one that I didn't really want to leave out because it's important that if you are looking to this as maybe your main strategy, or you're considering it as an idea, that you get the right information. And considering this kind of strategy, there's plenty of misinformation out there, and it's simple to kind of make mistakes, and it's a strategy that if you get wrong, then there's quite severe penalties as well. So you want to make sure you understand all the legal and health and safety regulations that go along with it. So if you are going to do it, that you do it properly. Now, it might sound bewildering at first, and there's certainly ways to get the information that you need that are just readily available. There's plenty of government and local council websites that have lots of information. It's all free, and this is usually the first port of call, really, if you're serious about doing HMOs as a strategy, because as regulations change, it's important to kind of get the information directly from the horse's mouth, if it were. So what the council's saying and what the government's saying. And I'll keep you updated as well with information on this thread and in the comment section below if there's any changes that we notice. But local housing officers from the council are very helpful, and they're certainly a good point of call and worth contacting to see what your individual local kind of requirements are, because when it comes to understanding the area, there are certain changes and legislation and mandatory requirements for HMOs, or additional requirements for HMOs that are maybe more specific per council. Now they'll help you even with your market research, and they'll give you an idea of where the town is oversaturated currently with HMOs and maybe where there's potential to add more, because they'll want to limit the growth of potentially maybe saturating a particular postcode or street or location with a lot of HMOs. So it's worth kind of having a chat with them and just seeing where their viewpoint is on the market as well at the moment. Now, it's important still to note that take it with a pinch of salt, still do your own research. Their role simply isn't going to be just to kind of make you money, but to improve the housing situation for the area. So where they may kind of point you in the direction of may not be best suited for you, but it's still a good first stop really to try and get that extra bit of information. Now, the most demand for HMOs and roomlets are typically going to be in larger cities or towns. And there's a website called spareroom.co.uk, and this has a rental index, and you can see the link here. So it's well worth going to kind of have a look at visit, and if this is your strategy. Well, there's lots of landlords and tenants on this kind of site that go to find and also to list rooms to let. It's probably the most popular kind of room rental site in the UK at the moment. And as part of this site, they provide a free room, what they call a rental index. And this shows you the actual demand across the country in different locations for room lets based on the data from their site. So it will show you as a very good guide what the local demand might be in your area in terms of how many tenants are maybe looking for room lets and have adverts that are placed. And you can also have a bit of a snoop around on the site and just see how many properties are listed and the type and the quality. And it's a great resource really if you're looking at the HMO strategy to get an idea of the demand and also the competition and the supply. Now, to understand where the money is in HMOs and where you're going to kind of make your profit and your cash flow, like the same really with vanilla buy-to-lets, you can still certainly benefit from capital growth, but the main benefit of HMOs really is in the increased rental yield. Now, when compared to standard buy-to-lets, the rental yield that we'd recommend, as I mentioned on those previously, was around 8% plus. On HMOs, you should be targeting a much higher rental yield than that. Now, we typically suggest a minimum of around 12% gross rental yield, just to make it kind of worth considering. But typically on a lot of properties that we look at for HMOs, we're looking to achieve around 15%. So that's 15% plus yields. Now, the downside to HMOs is that they do require more time and more management. So managing a couple of these properties can be a real handful and for a lot of investors, and that's not really the reasons why they got involved in property, which is why it's a bit of a Marmite kind of strategy really. You either love it or you hate it, depending upon your situation and which way you're looking to develop. Now, it's important that you have a managing agent that's skilled looking after these properties if that's the route you're going to go down, and if you're not going to be hands-on managing the property yourself. And certainly if you want to scale and systemize this strategy, you will need to have a managing agent on board. Now, for HMOs, it's important to note that the running costs of the properties are higher too. So as a general rule of thumb, we've typically found that, again, worst case scenario, it's around sort of 4 to 5 months rental income to run a HMO. Now that might seem high, but that covers everything from all of the costs that a lot of investors tend to ignore when it comes to things like maintenance, arrears, void periods, utility bills, the insurance and the management, and there's just a lot more costs that go into operating that property. But obviously the income's higher as well. So just as a kind of typical example, if it were, in a 4 or 5 bed multi-let, you usually find that the income from one of the room covers the cost of maintenance and utility bills, voids and arrears. And this is a quarter of the property, or seen another way, it's the quarter of your yearly rental income, which is equivalent to around 3 months when you spread it out over the year. And then another month's income is then usually enough to cover things like the management costs and the insurance. And this is a very general kind of rule of thumb, but one that helps you to look at HMOs quite quickly and see if the overall rental return is going to be right for you at the end of it in terms of the level of effort that's involved. Certainly you can earn kind of extra income, as we said, and it's a cash flow strategy, but there are aspects to it to consider. Now, if you don't include bills, then your return on paper is certainly going to look higher, but you'll probably end up charging less per room. So it swings and roundabouts really, and at the end of the day, typically we've seen that it tends to average out over time. Now, self-managed in property is certainly one way to reduce your costs, and you can save a healthy kind of chunk of this money that you'd usually have going to pay for a managing agent, and certainly increase your yields. But as I said, it's not practical if you're looking to scale. And either way, if you do choose to kind of manage or use a letting agent or self-manage the property yourself, your your net yield is still going to be higher than if you were to just simply be looking at single lets. But it's personal choice, and it's something you need to weigh up if it's worth the extra time involvement to get it up and running, and to also find the right tenants. We've used multi-lets in our portfolio, and we still do use multi-lets in our portfolio, but for my situation and for what I'm looking to achieve, I wouldn't kind of just do multi-lets across the whole portfolio. It's nice to have some single lets as well to balance it out a little bit, but it's personal preference. It's what you're kind of looking to do and achieve with your strategies. Now, to give you a bit of an idea in terms of who situation this might be best for, we typically say cash rich and time poor individuals. Now, there is another strategy that if you're the kind of reverse situation of that, so if you're maybe time rich and cash poor, then it might be a bit more suitable for you. But certainly for buying HMOs and running the HMO strategy, you do need cash to use for the large deposits needed, also any refurbishments required, and generally it's just a bit more of an cash intensive type of strategy. Also, it's important to note that really from a financial perspective and raising finance to buy the property, that it can actually be a little bit difficult, or more difficult certainly, to buy properties with HMOs. Using finance to buy properties as HMOs than it is to buy vanilla kind of buy-to-lets, as it's a completely different concept, and most mortgage lenders take the view that it should only really be more experienced landlords that go into this market and manage these properties. So there's different requirements to meet. Usually they require larger deposits, so it's a case of checking with your mortgage broker, just seeing what your situation is and how that might relate to what finance you should be able to achieve on the property. Okay, so next we're going to look at the type of assets that will probably help you best if you're looking at this kind of strategy. The first is some experience of owning properties as a landlord. So this will not only give you experience in terms of how to manage tenants, but also the expectations of what the property generally over a period of time is going to involve in terms of the level of maintenance, the level of work, understanding a little bit more about the business as a whole, really. The next is the ability to raise commercial finance, and not just standard buy-to-lets is certainly going to be beneficial as well, because when you're raising finance to buy a buy-to-let, as I said, it's a different kind of market and a different lender typically that would, or certainly a different mortgage product that you'd be using. Commercial finance is widely used for HMOs, and it's often kind of recommended and looked at, so the ability to raise commercial finance is a good asset as well. Next is great kind of local management contacts to manage the agents, or to manage the property, sorry. So you're not necessarily just looking at an agent that's going to be great to manage a whole portfolio for you, and the properties are going to be different areas. You want someone that's locally on the ground, because there is a little bit more work involved in these types of properties, and having someone local is going to give you a good advantage and just cut out a lot of the problems. And then the fourth one is just experience of managing different types of tenants. So if you're self-managing, or even if you're using a letting agent, then the experience of managing HMO tenants is going to be beneficial. You don't really want to be giving the property to a letting agent that's got no experience of HMOs, because they'll struggle to let it out, they'll struggle to manage the tenancies, and they'll struggle to manage the expectations of those tenants when they're moving into the property and when they're in the property as well. Okay, next we're going to look at the time frame to get up and running with this strategy. So typically we'd say around 3 to 6 months is a good idea, and this really depends on the property that you're looking to buy, as some HMOs will require licensing. Now that might be classed as mandatory licensing for the area, or additional licensing, or even something called selective licensing, and you can get all of that information, as I mentioned, from the local council websites. But often it's a case that not all properties that may be suitable for HMOs are already up and running as licensable HMOs. You might buy one that's currently a family property or currently a vacant property that may work well for turning into a HMO property. May require licensing, but once it's up and running, it'll be a great investment. So it's just a case of considering really that that is something you need to look at. And the licensing really is just a case for the council to want you to meet certain criteria in terms of the health and safety and the legislation setup that we discussed earlier. Now, other times you may also need some planning permission for the property. Now, it's not always the case. It depends on what class the property is kind of listed or registered as, and certainly to be used as a HMO. Often it's a case of there's going to be some maybe planning requirements or change in the planning in order to have that kind of correct classification from another form of accommodation. And this is why the time frame is usually a little bit longer than, say, the more straightforward kind of buy-to-let properties, really, because of the licensing and potentially the planning requirements to consider. Now, it's important to know and understand the rules and regulations and the downsides, as I said, and certainly keep abreast of the different regulations involved. There's a blog that I've written that you can access on our website here. It gives you a little bit more information about kind of multi-lets, and then whenever we do kind of new blogs and stuff, we'll add it to to the site and send you a link as well. But typically it's just a case of keeping abreast of any kind of change in legislations or regulations really. And later on in the training I'll provide all the necessary links as well to those legislation requirements that you do need to meet as a HMO kind of landlord, so you can see everything kind of laid out. But if you want that quicker, as I mentioned, just go onto the council websites, and there's certainly going to be a great deal of information there to help you out. Alternatively, you can also buy a property that's already running as a HMO. This is going to speed up the process and be much quicker. You may end up paying a small premium because it's already set up as a functioning HMO in business, if it were, but it's worth considering which is the best option for you. Now we're going to look at a brief example really in terms of how this plays out in terms of the figures involved and the potential kind of returns. And there's a couple of assumptions that we need to kind of consider, and the first one is that equity and capital growth is going to be similar to a standard kind of buy-to-let for this example. There may be some kind of slight changes when it's a HMO, but we're just going to be looking at rental yields in this comparable. The next is that the mortgage is based on a £75,000 loan and is going to be interest only at 6% for the mortgage, and then the other costs are going to be based on, as we said, worst case scenario. So let's say there's 5 months worth of rental income that's going to be need to set aside for maintenance, management fees, voids, arrears, insurance, utility bills, and a load of other kind of miscellaneous costs that might be involved in operating and running that property. So they're just some quick assumptions to take into account. And then this is the breakdown really of how the figures may pan out based on this example. I'm just going to leave those on the screen for you to have a quick kind of look at and read through, and then we'll go through it in detail in a second. Okay, so as we mentioned, the return on investment here is simply going to be an example based on your rental income or your rental yield. So let's say the typical purchase costs for this property are 105,000, and we're looking to achieve a gross rental yield of 15%, which, as I said, is what we're kind of targeting mainly on our properties at the moment. Can target, as I said, a minimum we'd usually recommend of say 12%, but we're looking at 15% on the majority, so we're going to use that in this example. And this would give you a gross rental income of this figure here. So 15,750. And then the mortgage payments, letting costs, and your total cost of kind of running this property really. And then the net rental income. And then the total invested. Again, if we're looking at a similar comparable as to, if you remember the vanilla buy-to-let kind of video where we were looking at £100,000 purchase with £5,000 costs and 25% deposit. So your total investment on this deal is going to be 30,000. So that's your deposit and your purchase costs. And then this is going to be your net return on investment. So that's going to be your return after you've covered all of your running costs, your finance on the property, and you can see kind of the breakdown here of the examples. So again, I'm just going to leave that on the screen just for a couple more seconds. But as you can see, the kind of the return really compared to standard buy-to-lets, so your return on investment is going to be higher for your rental income based on a HMO. So it's just a case of weighing up those figures and seeing if that extra work involved is worth it. And as I mentioned, this example is based on using a managing agent as well to manage that property for you. Now, to give you a bit of real life examples on some properties that we've done as HMOs in the past, how they've worked out, and somehow in terms of a couple of case studies on how they've not gone very well, and a case study on how they have gone in terms of where they've been successful. So to give you an idea of where I've made mistakes in the past and kind of where I've had kind of problems, so hopefully you can kind of avoid them and experience or learn from kind of my experience. So the very first property that I did as a HMO was a real learning curve. It was quite a baptism of fire in terms of understanding how they worked and some of the mistakes that I made. But it was only a 4-bedroom property, and I felt like that was quite a good balance to start off with, to have not too many kind of tenants or too many rooms in a shared property. It was something to kind of get, I suppose, dip my feet in the water and just kind of, or just dip my toes in the water and just kind of test it and see kind of how it worked. And this was probably my first mistake really. Now, from experience, I've learned that it's hard to make a decent profit from a simple 4-bedroom HMO purely because the level of rental income that you're getting back on the property is not always going to be enough to balance out the extra work and maintenance and just the potential kind of hassle required really. Bizarrely, they can even take some slightly more management than maybe a 5 or a 6-bedroom HMO, not as you'd probably think as less, because when you've got smaller margins, every penny is going to kind of count, and you want to try and keep any void periods, any utility bills extremely low, just so you can kind of keep up your margins because they are quite tight. So that can mean you kind of just spending a bit more focus and attention and management on it, which could distract from other things or the properties or your other portfolio. Now, the property that we're kind of talking about here, the location was great. It was right in the town centre. It had always rented well. It was currently set up as a multi-let and a HMO previously, and that's one of the reasons why I went for it. Again, it seemed like a good kind of entry into the market, but the location really wasn't the problem. Because what I kind of found out really is that the transients, or what I learned quite quickly, is that tenants that are kind of renting rooms by rooms are more transient. So they tend to move. They're in areas for a shorter period of time, maybe for a work placement, or maybe because they're new to the area. And they tend to have just simply a higher turnover of tenants than your standard kind of normal lets. So your traditional kind of family lets, or individuals or couples, if it were. And this was my second mistake, because the property was about 45 minutes drive away from me, and on a traditional let this isn't a problem. I've got properties that are about an hour and a half away on some occasions in terms of where they're currently located to where I live, but on a multi-let, when you're self-managing, a 45-minute drive is going to become a real pain after a while, because the drive to do regular viewings adds up, and it can be a real drain on your time and a poor use of time really. And this was probably the most costly mistake that I'd kind of looked at on this property. Was actually the managing costs of the property, because of this kind of constant time drain and travelling. In addition, the costs of actually managing the property on an ongoing basis were pretty high, because one thing I'd always thought about, and I've done since with my kind of shared properties, is include utility bills. Now, there's an argument for and against this. Some landlords prefer not to include bills because they can kind of get abused and kind of go around to do a viewing on the property and the windows are left open, the heating's on full pelt and it's the summer, and it can get frustrating, shall we say, when you're going around and the situation is, or the property's kind of left like that. But when you're managing room lets, there's a strong argument to say that tenants want things simple. They don't want to necessarily have to split utility bills with the other tenants. They don't necessarily want to have that worry of somebody in the room that's just moved in having to try and divvy up those kind of bills and accounts, and somebody not having enough money that week and somebody else having to pay extra. It can just cause a little bit of friction where it's not needed to. So offering an all-inclusive property that includes all bills and utilities, council tax, broadband, that type of thing, is definitely a selling point in this market, and it certainly helps to get the properties let quicker. But as I said, the downside to that is that the tenants then don't tend to take too much ownership of the costs of running the property, and the high kind of utility bills that may come through in terms of gas and electric and the rest of it. So you find tenants regularly not paying attention to how much kind of they're using, and that's where bills can kind of run away with you really. And this was where my kind of third mistake lied in this example, because simply just giving tenants clear instructions on how to use the boiler, and not to put it on constant when they're kind of going out of the property, I assumed would be kind of okay, and that seemed kind of reasonable. But in the very first month of my first HMO, my gas bill was £250, and this was in the summer, which was absolutely bonkers because they just literally left it on what seemed like permanently. So the only way to kind of tackle this situation is to try and restrict the level of usage, so by putting maybe a fair clause policy in the agreements where they have like an allowance of how much they can use, and anything over that you kind of charge extra, and then just obviously keep reminding them when it gets close. Or the other option is to put electric heating in the property, and then you can have It's a bit of more work required, so it depends on how you're setting it up, but you can have electric meters in the property for each individual room, so every room is individually kind of charged, if it were, and then they can kind of pay for their own usage, and you would, as the landlord, just cover the utility costs for the communal areas, and then the tenants would cover their costs for their own individual bedrooms. So like you would have a card meter in a more traditional type property, you'd have the same. There's a little bit more cost to kind of set this up, but I know a few landlords who are running this, and their utility bills for the year are around £200, which again just seems bonkers because all they're paying for is the communal area, which is minimal at best, and then the rooms are being paid for by the individual tenants. So that's one way to certainly get around this problem. But in terms of experience and what I've learned from doing it this way, there's three things I'd certainly do differently are going to be: one is to keep a strict control on the utility bills. If you have broadband, put call barring on the outgoing kind of calls for the line, for example, so they're not racking up phone bills. If you have gas central heating, use kind of thermostats, timers, just ways to kind of control the cost so it's not left on permanently. Also, choose your location kind of carefully in terms of where the property is going to be. We chose a great location for this property in terms of the location of the actual property to the town, but as I said, it's about 45 minutes away, so you want to try and stay local, especially if you're self-managing multi-lets. If you use a letting agent, there's an argument for saying invest out of area, so it's just really a case of which works best for you. And then the third one is really try and go for a few more bedrooms where possible, instead of just going for the minimum of, say, or a small number of bedrooms like 4, try and go for 5 or more bedrooms. This is going to give you more leeway in terms of flexibility if costs are a little bit higher, but more income. And it's going to be you going through the same hassle of setting it up and running it as a property of house of multiple occupations, so you might as well try and earn that extra bit of income from it. And that doesn't mean to try and just jam in a load of small bedrooms or anything like that. It's simply a case of just making the property work as best as you can. So hopefully that's given you a bit of an intro in terms of maybe the mistakes that I've made previously and how to avoid them, and just a very quick example on where it can go right. HMOs in a very I suppose in a buoyant market like it is at the moment for room lets can work very well, and if they're in the right location it's perfect, but if they're in the wrong location then they will struggle to let, the same as any property. So they do need to be in specific areas, and if they even a poorly performing property, if you do kind of manage it correctly, you can still kind of turn these around. And this is what we did on this example here in a 4-bedroom multi-let or HMO in Manchester. So this is a property that had always been a student let typically previously with the current landlord. They'd had it for a student let for a number of years before, but the market in Manchester had changed in terms of the locations of where students were renting. Were getting closer and closer to the main areas, so this was on the peripheral area, and it just kind of shrunk in terms of where students were wanting to let. But also there's a big kind of migration in terms of tenants moving from more, I suppose, older houses into purpose-built developments from the university that are set up as nice en suites, brand new buildings, and they're closer to the universities. So there's a bit of a trend in student tenants moving out of those areas. And because this particular property was on the fringe, the owner had struggled to start getting regular tenants and was having quite high void periods. So we kind of met them, put a proposal together, and we took over the property and looked to change the tenant profile from the more traditional kind of student tenants that they had previously to working tenants and working professionals. As we were self-managing, we could also be a bit more flexible with the tenant terms in terms of charging lower or no admin fees. We could do shorter lets, and we could take smaller deposits as well. So by being a little bit more flexible, we could kind of stand out a little bit more from the competition in the area. And the property was already in a great condition. It was ready to let, fully furnished, already had some rooms tenanted when we took over. It was just a case of trying to improve the situation. Now, with the management changes that we were able to bring in, we're able to turn it around quite quickly, and the property now rents at around £80 per week, which gives us about, I think it's 1,386 per month gross rent when fully tenanted. Now a single let in this same area would only generate £650 per month. Now there's obviously costs to include, and by managing the voids, what we did was kind of reduce the, I suppose, the previous problems that the property was having. But Simply selecting the right long-term tenants, keeping on top of the utility costs. We're able to make more profit on this property than the previous landlord was able to do, and certainly get a better return than if it was just rented out as a single let. So HMOs, as I mentioned, can be a great strategy. Simply just look for the ones in the right areas, make sure it's got tenant demand, and make sure you're operating it as a business, and you are, if you're not going to be doing this out there managing, the agent's doing it, that you're hands on to try and reduce those costs, then it can certainly be a lucrative strategy. So hopefully you found that introduction into HMOs helpful, and I look forward to catching up with you on the next topic.